I did a video a while back looking at GitHub Actions. It was a fun video because I never used it at all at the time. And at the time of the video, I like to cover technologies by just going in blind. I got access to the beta back then and was super excited to try it out. Today, the CI/CD of my personal website runs on GitHub Actions, and my personal website runs on Kubernetes. And I know that's overkill, but I also have a lot of other things running, so it makes sense to schedule it all on a Kubernetes environment. And I liked GitHub Actions quite a lot, and since then I made a video of how to host your own GitHub Action runner on Kubernetes. Take a look at that video down in the description below. And a few days ago, I got another email saying that I have access to the GitHub CodeSpaces beta. So I thought it'd be a good idea to see what the fuss is all about. Now, what is this, you might ask? A while ago, GitHub announced something pretty cool. If you go to any arbitrary GitHub repo, when you press the dot character, then magic happens. Now, some of you might not have seen this before, but this is pretty cool. You have a VS Code IDE running in your browser, targeting the repo that you're on. So you can see I have my Docker development YouTube series, which is the GitHub repo we use to create all these videos. And I've always liked the idea of being able to run applications in the browser, just because of portability, and being able to code right in the browser is pretty neat. Just the idea of being on a beach or somewhere remote and all you have is a tablet like an iPad, and you fire up a browser and you can start writing scripts, edit YAML files, run CI/CD pipelines, write code, and what have you. The idea of portability is something I'd really liked for a long time, ever since Docker came out. If we think of Docker containers and we know we can run them anywhere, doesn't matter the operating system, doesn't matter what's installed on the machine. And these days browsers can also run anywhere. I'm almost sure you can run a browser on your fridge. And this is pretty cool because I can browse the folder structure, like I can go into my Kubernetes tutorials, I can take a look at code, YAML files, Docker files, I can browse the source code, I can even go and write a change to the code. I can open up source control, I can even go and create a new branch, and this allows me to create and switch to that branch. I can click the GitHub icon on the left. I can even look at pull requests and issues. So I can go ahead and raise a new pull request from the branch that I just made changes on and raise a pull request to merge that into master. So this is great if you need an IDE on the go, you need to make some documentation changes, raise some pull requests, look at issues, monitor your Git repos and so forth. Or if you need to sit and just catch up on documentation. Now, GitHub CodeSpaces takes this web version of VS Code to a whole nother level. It gives you a secure, configurable, and dedicated development environment that works how and where you want it to. So you can think of it as a remote development box in the cloud. So CodeSpace is basically a development environment that's hosted in the cloud. I would like to think of it as VS Code as a service, which sounds pretty cool. So what else can this thing do? We've got getting started, developing in a code space. We can create a code space, do development, source control, raise pull requests, delete a code space. We can even forward ports. So if you're thinking of something like working on a web app where you need port 80, port 443, different ports exposed, you can totally forward ports from your local machine to this environment. You can set environment variables, connect to a private network, and this all sounds pretty great. So what this looks like is pretty much you have your code editor over here, which is running in your browser, or you can even use your local VS Code installation. And when you fire up a code space, it basically connects to Azure on a virtual machine. It launches a container for you with a clone of your repo, language support, and certain tooling that you want, like extensions. So if we go over to our Git repo, you usually have code where you can clone the repo. If you click into that, you can now see we have a code spaces tab, and we can create code spaces on specific branches. So if you open up this for the first time, you can go ahead and launch a code space. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and this will set up a code space. You can see it's connecting. It builds a Docker container for your dev environment, And here we go. Now you can also see it gives you a customized URL at the top. So it's the name of the repo and some random characters .github.dev. And here we've got a full IDE running in our browser. And this time we can now actually go ahead and access source code as we have a terminal now running. So you can see here I've got all my files and folders that are on the left here. This is pretty cool. I can change the size just like a normal VS Code. And let's take a look. Where are we? If I do cat os release, we are actually running in an Ubuntu server, looks like. And what do we have access to? We've got curl. So curl is installed. And do I have Docker? Ooh, we've got Docker as well. If I do Docker PS, what's actually running? Okay, there's no containers running here. Do I have kubectl? I even have kubectl. So this is pretty interesting. So it comes with a bunch of stuff pre-installed. So if I go to the Kubernetes folder and I go to tutorial basic, I have a README file, and this is my latest Kubernetes tutorial. And in this tutorial, we've taken a traditional architecture with a web app, a database. We built Docker files, containerized the environment, and learned how to deploy this to Kubernetes with an ingress Nginx proxy in the front. If you're new to Kubernetes, check out the link down below so you can follow along. So we know we have Docker, and in the tutorial we talk about understanding containers, and we create a Docker network. So let's see if we can do that. So I'm going to create a Docker network called WordPress. So I say Docker network create WordPress. That creates a network, so that works. I'm going to change directory to the Kubernetes tutorials basics folder, and in this folder I have a bunch of Docker files under a Docker files folder. If we take a look at it, I have WordPress and MySQL. So this is where the fun starts. If we take a look at this Docker file, we have a basic WordPress running on 5.9 Apache, and we have a basic MySQL instance, all defined as Docker files. So we can go ahead and build these Docker files by saying docker build -f, point it to the Docker file, and I'm going to tag it as WordPress example. Go ahead and paste that to the terminal, and it looks like the code space can actually build a Docker file. So this is pretty neat. We can go ahead and build custom containers. Now let's try to run our container by saying docker run -it. I'm going to expose port 80, and I'm going to run this container on that WordPress network that I created. So I go ahead and paste that, and look what happens here. Okay, so we've got WordPress running. We can see here that our application is running port 80. So it detected that we want to expose port 80. We can click to open it in the browser, but what caught my eye is this tab here, ports. It's got one port that's forwarded automatically. So you can see it detected port 80. We have like some sort of local address here. So it creates our own custom address. I can go ahead and copy this local address. It tells us what process is running, and it has a visibility setting. So you can actually switch this visibility setting over to public. You can also change the port to HTTP or HTTPS. This is pretty cool. So when you're building stuff locally and you want someone to review your pull request, you can send them a link. So I go ahead and paste this link in the browser, and you can see it does some sort of proxy magic. And here we go. So it's taking us to WordPress. So it's got the container. You can see wp admin setup config.php. We're now accessing our container, but I don't have the MySQL instance up and running. It's going to ask us here for a database name, username, password. I'm not going to go that far. We can see that we can actually run containers. So this is pretty neat. So it gives us a sandbox to build and test stuff, share it with your team. They can review. So that is pretty cool. So far we've got VS Code running in the browser, a DevBox in the cloud. This is very cool, very exciting for developers and DevOps engineers. But how far can we take this? Like for DevOps engineers, it's all cool that we can go ahead and edit YAML files, change configuration, work with CI/CD pipelines, build and run containers. But in modern DevOps, you're probably going to need a Kubernetes cluster. So what if we can use our dev sandbox in the cloud in our code space and get a Kubernetes cluster up and running? So you all probably heard of Minikube by now, but there's this other cool project called Kind, which allows you to run a Kubernetes cluster in a lightweight Docker container, which is really useful for DevOps engineers that want to spin up Kubernetes sandboxes to test Helm charts and all sorts of Kubernetes stuff. So what we can do is we can go to the GitHub icon on the far right, go to releases, and what do we have here? We have the Linux AMD 64. I can go ahead and copy this URL, and in my dev box, let's go ahead and control C out of that WordPress container. Now I have curl, so I can say curl -L, and let's go ahead and download that, and I'm just going to download it. It's called kind, and look, here we go. We got the kind binary on the left. I can go ahead and say chmod. Let's give it execution rights, and we can say /kind. And now we have kind installed, so we can try to spin up a Kubernetes cluster if this allows us to. Now it's pretty cool that there's stuff installed in this code space, and it's pretty cool that we can use curl to pull in things that we need. But this is not always ideal. If you want to spin up a dev environment in the cloud, you kind of want all your tools pre-installed. And the cool thing is, with CodeSpaces, there's an easier way. Now, I have been spending quite a bit of time digging through the documentation, and there is a way to set up your repository for CodeSpaces and also create your own custom dev container. So basically, GitHub gives you a CodeSpace with some stuff installed that they think you might need. But what if you're a Node.js developer, you need a specific version of Node, or you want kind because you want to spin up a Kubernetes cluster, or you just have a bunch of arbitrary stuff installed and you want maybe some custom VS Code extensions. So this is cool because you can create a custom configuration by writing your own devcontainer.json file. So if you're adding a single devcontainer.json file, it'll be used by everyone who creates a codespace from your repo. So this is pretty cool. In this tutorial video, I can create a dev container for everyone to use to run my tutorial. So it'll work for everyone. The right version of kind, the right version of everything that you need to run. All the dependencies are there. You can also create subdirectories if you want to give users a choice of different environments. And this is pretty well documented. GitHub shows you how to add a dev container configuration to your repository. So basically on your repo, GitHub will look for a folder called .devcontainer, and then it'll look by default for a devcontainer.json. You can change the hierarchy here to have custom files, but for now I'm just going to create one, and it gives you an example of what this file looks like. So this is pretty cool. You can give it a name, you can give it a custom Docker file. So this allows you to install everything you need in the sandbox. You can then set settings like specific shells, and you can give it a list of extensions you want to install, as well as change the user. So you can run as root or a non-privileged user. And the cool thing here is they give you some options. So this is a Node.js. They have a Python example. So you can see some cool stuff that you can do with Python. They have a C# example. You can even opt in to install the Azure CLI, and a Java example. And all of those options that you saw in the JSON file is all documented. So you can see all the different properties of what you can override. And the cool thing is you can even mount volumes. So here you can see you can pass in a Docker file, set build context and build arguments. So you can build any container that you like. For a full customized sandbox, you have some ports you want to expose, volume mounts you want to create. It even supports Docker Compose. So what I've gone ahead and done is I've created a custom branch. So if I click on this branch and I changed my branch to CodeSpaces, I created a custom branch called CodeSpaces. And in this branch, if we take a look at the code, I've created a dev container folder with a dev container JSON file. And I've set up my own little dev environment. So I've given it a name. This is the Kubernetes tutorial basic. So you can go ahead and use this CodeSpace to run through my Kubernetes tutorial. Then I've specified a Docker file. You can see that Docker file on the left. So by default, the working environment for setting up this container will be in this .dev container folder. So the CodeSpace knows to expect a Docker file in this working directory. And I've specified some build arguments I want to pass to my container. So when I install stuff in the container, I might want to specify different versions of things. We'll take a look at that in a second. Then because I'm building a custom container, I want Docker to be available. So what I've done is I've specified a volume mount, and I'm mounting var run docker.sock. So this will give me access to the Docker runtime, so I can spin up containers from my CodeSpace. And then I keep the settings as default. I'm just going to use bin sh instead of bin bash because I'm going to run a lightweight Alpine container, and my remote user is root. So here's my Docker file that I created. I said from Alpine, I pass in kind because I want to go ahead and install kind. I want a few things. I want curl and I want Docker CLI so we can run Docker commands. I go ahead and download kubectl. I move it to user local bin so we can run kubectl kubectl commands, and then I go ahead and download kind as well. Give it chmod, move it to user local bin as well. So we have Docker, we have curl, we have kind, and kubectl. So now we've defined our developer sandbox in a Docker container as a Docker file. Now how do we go ahead and spin this up? Well, it's really simple. With the dev container folder now ready to go, all I need to do is go back to my repo. I'm going to click on code. I'm going to manage code spaces. I'm just going to go ahead and delete this code space. Then because my code space is in a specific branch, I'm going to go ahead and switch to that branch. By the time you guys watch this video, this would have been merged to master. So you can launch the code space directly from master. I'm going to go ahead and switch branch to code space. And you can see there's my dev container folder. So now what I do is I click on code and I say create a code space on the code spaces branch. Go ahead and click that and look what happens now. It will detect that we have a container image. So it goes ahead and builds that container. We can even view the logs and the container is now built. And here we go. So now we've got our IDE in the browser again. This time we can see our terminal looks a little bit different. And let's see if we have our tools. So we got Docker. We can say Docker PS, and we can actually see, because we're mounting in the Docker sock, we can actually see this code space. So this code space is running in a container and we can now see it as well. I can say kubectl, so I got access to that, and I can run kind. So let's go back to the Kubernetes tutorial, Kubernetes tutorials, and click on the README, and we can skip past the Docker side. We've already played with that. Now we want to create a Kubernetes cluster. Now to do that, I'm going to say kind create cluster, and I'm going to run a 1.23.5 Kubernetes cluster. So I just allow pasting, and I paste that to the terminal, and there we go. So now our kind cluster is spinning up. And it's pretty exciting that this is actually working. So you can see it's going and downloading the node image for Kubernetes. It's gone ahead and prepared the nodes, setting it all up. No errors so far. Installing CNI, setting everything up, and boom, we have a cluster. I do Docker PS and you can see our node is running. I say kubectl get nodes, and moment of truth. There we go. We have a kind cluster running. Now, can we actually use this Kubernetes cluster is the question. So let's go ahead and create a namespace called CMS. I'm going to go ahead and run kubectl create namespace, set that up, and let's deploy everything to that namespace. So in our tutorial, we spoke about config maps. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new config map for MySQL. This is just a config map to tell MySQL we want to run a random root password. We can see the config map has been created. So we've taken a look at config maps. In the next part, we take a look at secrets. So in our tutorial video, we talk about secrets, and we create two secrets, one for WordPress to define the database connection string so that WordPress knows where to connect to. And then we create another connection string for MySQL indicating the base user, the password for that user, and the standard MySQL database to run everything on. So I go ahead and I paste the first part, which is creating the secret for WordPress, and then I also want to paste the secret for MySQL. So now we have two secrets, one for MySQL, one for WordPress. Now we can move over to the deployment part of the tutorial. So for that, I'm going to change directory to Kubernetes tutorials basics, and in here I have my YAML files, which you can see on the left. We have a deployment for WordPress. We have a service to expose WordPress internally, not externally. We have a stateful set where we're going to run MySQL, and we have an ingress to access our WordPress instance. So to deploy WordPress, I'm going to say kubectl in the CMS namespace apply -f. I am going to apply the deployment.yaml. Go ahead and run that, and if we say kubectl get pods, we can see two WordPress containers are busy creating. Now to expose WordPress internally, I would need a service. So I have a cluster IP service in the YAML folder as well. Just service.yaml, go ahead and apply that. That is a local cluster IP service, so it doesn't have any external IP. That is just so that we can access WordPress from within the cluster. To expose it publicly, we'll use an ingress. So the next part is a stateful set. So I'm going to deploy MySQL using a stateful set. I'm going to deploy it saying kubectl -n cms. I'm going to apply in the YAML folder stateful set.yaml. Go ahead and apply that. And if I do kubectl get pods, now we have WordPress running and we have MySQL creating. Now to test all of this, we want public access to our WordPress, and we know it's not the right thing to expose WordPress directly to the public. So we're going to be using an ingress controller, and to do that, I'm going to use the standard Nginx ingress controller. I'm going to apply version 1.1.3, and I'm going to just apply it directly from GitHub, the cloud deploy.yaml. So I'm going to deploy that ingress controller, go ahead and run that. That'll set up a namespace, deploy everything in the ingress Nginx namespace. We can take a look at that installation by running kubectl in the ingress Nginx namespace, get pods, and it is busy setting everything up at the moment. And after a couple of seconds, we can run get pods again. We can now see we have an Nginx ingress controller which is running and ready to go. And to expose our WordPress instance, I'm going to deploy an ingress YAML file. Go ahead and apply that. If we take a look at that ingress file, that'll just say all traffic coming to ingress on path / go to WordPress. So it'll take all the traffic coming to it and pass it down to WordPress. Very simple ingress example. Now, how do we test this? We saw earlier that we can run and test containers with the automatic port forwarding feature, but we know in Kubernetes we can port forward to pods and services as well. And it's pretty interesting, but I'm not sure if we can get a load balancer running in GitHub CodeSpaces, maybe for a future video. In this example, I'm going to use kubectl port forward. I'm going to say kubectl in the ingress Nginx namespace. I'm going to say I want to port forward, and I want to port forward to the service ingress that I've just deployed on port 80. So I go ahead and run that, and look what happens. It detects that we are forwarding a port. So again, it said that your application running on port 80 is now available. I can then go to this little tab over here, and we can see that it's gone ahead and detected and set up an address for us again. This is pretty cool. So we have a custom address. I can go ahead and copy that address, run that in the browser. It's doing its magic, and there we go. So we have our custom URL at the top. It's hitting our ingress controller and routing to our WordPress pods. We can see we now have the same page where we can go ahead and set up WordPress. So I can go ahead and select a language, and we can kick off the WordPress installation. I can just create a test site. I'm going to just fill out some dummy details, and I'm going to say install WordPress, and success. We have WordPress installed, and we can go ahead and log in. And there we go. We now have a WordPress site set up. Now you'll probably notice that if you hover over some of the URLs that they're set to localhost, because WordPress will use localhost by default. If we want to go ahead and mess around and change that, we can go ahead and kubectl exec into the MySQL pod, and we can go ahead and override the URL for WordPress. And we want to set it to this URL that we have at the top here. So I have documented this for you in the devcontainer.json, just a couple of comments that I've set there if you want to go ahead and play with it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run a MySQL command. The user is just called example user, and the password is example password. And we are now in MySQL, and I'm just going to go ahead and run these update statements. So I go ahead and update the options value for WP options, and I set the home page, and I also run the same command to set the site URL option. And then I can exit out of MySQL, exit out of the pod. I can go ahead and port forward again. And now you can see the content actually comes through and all the links work. So that is quite a bit of fun with GitHub CodeSpaces. So now you have no excuse to click on the link below and follow the guide to play with Kubernetes. You can even do this from your iPad. Now, if you liked the video, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell. And if you want to support the channel even further, check the Patreon link down below or click the join button to become a YouTube member. And as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.